Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e6. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn d7 to d5. Knight b1 to d2. Knight g8 to f6. Pawn e4 to e5. Knight f6 to d7. Bishop f1 to d3. Pawn c7 to c5. Pawn c2 to c3. Knight b8 to c6. Knight g1 to e2. Pawn c5 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Knight d7 to b6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to e7. Knight d2 to f3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to d2. Knight b6 to c4. Bishop d2 to c3. Knight c6 to b4. Bishop d3 to b1. Bishop c8 to d7. Pawn b2 to b3. Knight c4 to a3. Bishop b1 to d3. Knight a3 to b5. Pawn a2 to a3. Knight b4 takes d3. Queen d1 takes d3. Bishop e7 takes a3. Bishop c3 to d2. Bishop a3 to b2. Rook a1 to a2. Bishop b2 to a3. Pawn b3 to b4. Pawn b7 to b6. Knight e2 to g3. Pawn f7 to f5. Rook f1 to a1. Pawn f5 to f4. Rook a2 takes a3. Pawn f4 takes g3. Bishop d2 to g5. Pawn g3 takes f2, check. King g1 to f1. Queen d8 to c7. Rook a3 to a2. Queen c7 to c3. Queen d3 takes c3. Knight b5 takes c3. Rook a2 takes f2. Pawn a7 to a6. King f1 to g1. Knight c3 to e4. Rook f2 to a2. Rook f8 takes f3. Pawn g2 takes f3. Knight e4 takes g5. Rook a2 takes a6. Knight g5 takes f3, check. King g1 to h1. Rook a8 takes a6. Rook a1 takes a6. Pawn b6 to b5. Rook a6 to a7. Bishop d7 to c6. King h1 to g2. Knight f3 takes d4. Pawn h2 to h4. Knight d4 to c2. Rook a7 to e7. Pawn d5 to d4, check. King g2 to f2. Bishop c6 to d5. Rook e7 to e8, check. King g8 to f7. Rook e8 to b8. Bishop d5 to c6. Rook b8 to d8. King f7 to g6. Rook d8 to d6. Bishop c6 to d5. Rook d6 to b6. King g6 to f5. Pawn h4 to h5. Knight c2 takes b4. Rook b6 takes b5. Knight b4 to d3, check. King f2 to e2. Knight d3 takes e5. Rook b5 to b4. Bishop d5 to f3, check. King e2 to d2. Knight e5 to c6. Rook b4 to b7. Pawn e6 to e5. Rook b7 takes g7. Pawn h7 to h6. Rook g7 to g6. Bishop f3 to d5. King d2 to d3. Pawn e5 to e4, check. King d3 to c2. Knight c6 to b4, check. King c2 to b2. Knight b4 to d3, check. King b2 to c2. Knight d3 to e1, check. King c2 to b2. Knight e1 to d3, check. King b2 to a3. Pawn e4 to e3. Rook g6 to d6. Pawn e3 to e2. Rook d6 takes d5, check. Knight d3 to a5. King a3 to b2. Pawn e2 to e1, promoting to queen. Rook d5 takes d4. Queen e1 to e2, check. King b2 to c3. Queen e2 to e3, check. Rook d4 to d3. Queen e3 takes d3, check. King c3 to b2. Queen d3 to f3. King b2 to c2. King f5 to e4. King c2 to b2. Queen f3 to h3. King b2 to c2. Queen h3 to f3. King c2 to b2. Queen f3 to h3. King b2 to c2. King e4 to d4. King c2 to b2. Queen h3 to h2, check. King b2 to c1. Queen h2 to e2. King c1 to b1. Queen e2 to h2. King b1 to c1. Queen h2 to e2. King c1 to b1. Queen e2 to h2. King B1 to C1. The game is a draw.